check this out. So I got the LS50 limited edition blacks, and I got a matching pair of the 3001 SEs. These are the ones that I typically promote for entry level because they actually happen to be amazing for what they are. Like, not just for what they are, they're just, if this thing was $500, I would still say it's amazing. If this thing was $1,000, it would just be considered an exotic hi-fi speaker, and it would just be kind of reclassified as such. And then people would treat it as such. They would optimize it as such, and it would be a really, really good purchase still. Watch. Listen to the soundstage. I have them mono-blocked. So this section is playing there, this section is playing there, right? Let's compare the difference between the 3001 SEs and the LS50s. I'm gonna switch to a different song. Actually, let's switch to something, let's see. Do you have anything with vocals on this thing right now? Okay, let's transfer that over. Okay. There we go. Alright. Ready?
Cross out the ones who hurt my cries and watch me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
So basically, these sound a little bit brighter for the purposes of being a monitor. These sound a little bit more even as far as smooth, but they're more holographic due to the fact that as opposed to having a convex baffle where the unit Q only serves its function by the tweeter striking the Z-flex. So all the sound is only radiating from here, and the entire baffle is pretty much canceled out. It doesn't do anything. This design is actually meant to be a step further ahead. The baffle is actually meant to have a shadow guide around it, so that, see how the detail of the flare? This thing is actually three-dimensionally printed so that there's a whole rim that goes around here, and so that the flare from the horn angles down, strikes the woofer, and then the detail of the woofer ends up hitting the waveguide, which is actually a crescent shape. And the reason why they did that was because they were actually prototyping for the Blade. And I actually started looking into these things early on because I originally had the original LS50s that had the glossy sides, and this kind of seemed to make sense. I was thinking of getting the E301s because I thought they were all eggs, but these actually look more befitting because they're glossy and it has kind of this matte front. This has a matte front, and these were glossy. So I ended up swapping them out for the limited edition blacks so that the sides have the same kind of resin as the front. But it's still, once I got them, I was just like amazed by how good they sounded, just because I did not expect them to be anything but surround duty speakers. And now I actually use them as mains. As far as getting people to understand how to tune their sound for stereo holography, I would suggest these way over these because these are just much easier to replace. They're smaller, and if you buy them normally, not only are they like way cheaper, and you should actually look for ones that look like they match, or at least are mirrored or match, one or the other, because that means that they came from the same iteration. Because the series between 2001 SE, like the whole entire series, actually like evolved a lot to the point where they range in quality a lot. So you want to get the ones that kind of seem like they were matched from the same era. But so these right here are actually perfectly matched in the sense where even the serial number literally has the same serial number, and there's a code. I actually don't want to give away that code too much because now I'm going to be shooting myself in the foot because I still want to get them. But there's a code that tells you that they're actually a matched pair, whereas the other ones are just sequential. So these allow you to experience a Unicue with a more future-forward design, where it actually uses elements outside of the driver itself. So these things surprisingly sound bigger than these things do. These things sound exactly as big as this driver. This thing sounds as big as this kind of orb, I guess. Even like as far as standing in front of it. As far as this 3D soundstage, when you're back here, it just sounds more holographic in general. But doing this, yeah, so besides that, these are basically lab grade prototypes. I'm not freaking kidding you. Look at these freaking... These clips right here attached to the back of these solid metal binding posts. The metal binding posts are so freaking solid, they're solid all the way through. So there's actually a flare. So when I try sticking a banana plug in there, I can't miss. It literally just guides me in to that flare right in the middle. As opposed to being like a two-sectional thingy, it's literally a solid metal binding post. And even if I didn't want to twist anything, I would just stick a wire through here and I clip it on using this thing. It's basically designed to be twist-free. Like, you know, if you're just prototyping things, you would not want to keep twisting things on and off all the time. So you literally don't twist these things. Compare that to these, where they're like, you know, just plastic standard. But yeah, they also have ports that point downward at an angle, which makes it pretty cool. I would not wall mount them. The amount of detail in these is so ridiculous that the stands, when you buy them, they're not made out of tubes. They're actually literally freaking sword or blade shaped. Listen. Hear that? That's actually called a perfect fifth. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. They actually don't have a single resonance because it's not a tube, it's an ellipse. So the thing is naturally resistant to having any specific resonance, just like a tube would naturally have resonance. It is naturally just not. That's also why they make, you know, the elliptical port on the LS50. Ellipses are just naturally sound diffracting versus being like, you know, resonant. And the fact that it's a blade means that it may be wobbly sideways, but speakers don't actually piston sideways. They piston forward and backward, right? So not only is there the detail of it pistoning forward and backward so that the blade shape locks it in place when I'm pistoning forward and backwards so that it is very, very stable, but they even went as far as to make sure that the bass is actually not round, but there's literally fangs in the back. And that's really, really weird. That's like an attention. That's just more attention to detail that just blew my mind. Check this out. So I'm setting up a studio in here, so I got some more stands, and the way that these are designed are tolerant of carpet or hardwood floors or anything, any surface, because it's actually pretty much a tripod. If you wanted to rake them, you'd only need to add one thing right here, because watch what happens when I tilt this back. It can only tilt back by locking in to the teeth. There's no way for me to do it. If this was round, then it wouldn't have any sort of bias, right? So that it could actually roll and do all sorts of bad stuff. But since speaker is piston forward and backward, just like the way this thing is blade shaped, this thing cannot go backward without literally locking and biting into the carpet because of the two blades in the back. I was wondering why they're shaped that way. And then I was just playing them. I was like, just shocked by how that's pretty clever. You literally cannot actually get them off axis when you push them backward. They always stay on axis. That means that no matter how hard you play these things, if you pump them up, there's actually no way for it to actually not be off axis because it's actually forming a triangle. It's a tripod. And the way that it works is you can actually just place them on anything. You don't have to like specify, whether you're using you do that, penny trick thing where you're putting underneath the spikes because you're on carpet, or or sorry, when you're on hardwood floors, or you take, you use spikes when you're on carpet, you tune it up. You just put it down, you plop it down, and it works. That's it. And it's this grippy. It's not sliding around, and it's heavy as hell. Actually, it's not heavy. I mean, it's heavy enough. I mean, I can move it with one hand, but for what it is, it's solid as hell. But yeah, I was just shocked at the brilliance of this design, just the simplicity of it, and just how that works. The fact that it has like literally a two-tone res. If it had one tone, that would be bad. One tone would mean that there's a chance of standing waves. That means that it would hum, right? So the speaker would resonate down, and then whatever the actual frequency of the tube would then start building up. When there's actually two tones, that means that the two waves in there can't actually build up. They'd interfere with each other and destroy each other. So it's actually naturally anti-resonant. Just, and on top of it being just a really sturdy shape. So rather than cutting pipe, they made a blade shaped stand. They made it so that there's literal fangs in the back that bite into carpet, so that even when you tilt it back, it's still always facing the same direction. So if you have this thing perfectly faced and you accidentally tip them, you need a vacuum or something, you could still roll them back and bring them back into position, and they're exactly where they were. And if you wanted to rake them up, you could just place one spike or whatever underneath the front, and then it would form a tripod because the back two would form the back two teeth. It's a brilliant design. And for some reason, they stopped doing stuff like that and they started using tubes again, which is bizarre because for this thing, they just made this thing just awesome. And it's, I don't know, these are my gray ones, which are actually deliberately the ones I got that are mismatched and bad. So I'm just kind of using them as like reference monitors that are just bad. But yeah, the fact that they have like these solid metal, they literally made these from scratch for only this series and then never used them again. They made this from scratch for only this series and never used them again. Made that from scratch, never used it again. This whole entire thing is freaking made out of metal. You could take this baffle off. This baffle is made out of the same material as the baffle for the blade. And again, all those things were made custom and used just for this one series, and then they just never recycle it ever again. It's bizarre. And it's so bizarre that they're still using it as prototypes to this day. It's also the last speaker that plays up to 55 kilohertz plus or minus 3 dB, which is possible only because the one right before was the XQ series that got rid of the hybrid tweeter because it too could play up to 55 kilohertz plus or minus 3 dB. Oddly enough, every Unicue afterward, including the blade, only goes up to 48 plus or minus 3 dB. So these actually go 5 hertz above anything you'd ever need. Like, because 50 kilohertz is pretty much max of any master source quality you could ever have, and it goes 5 hertz above that. So in terms of spatial, I think that the actual holography of it has to do with the fact that it just has so much broadband headroom that, that and the fact that it has, like, the action around the driver, so that it's actually like, tweeter, waveguide. It's kind of like a fractal tweeter, waveguide, and then another waveguide on the outside. So it increases dispersion sideways, reduces ceiling and floor radiation. So that, that's pretty much how you want things, because you place these side by side. Placing it both forward increases dispersion sideways. When they're both facing forward, they would both cross over lateral in terms of stereo sum, and they'd end up flat. You want to see something else bizarre? For for this set of speakers, for some damn reason, they decided to make this thing. Actually, for the white ones, and that's why I have this thing. This thing is actually a freaking little mini amp that's designed for those speakers, and it supports video. I don't know why it would do such a thing, but it does. It even has a freaking UI. It's deprecated because it only supports old iPhones. Because I guess it was supposed to be some kind of high-end like iPhone thing. Because towards the end, when they finally got like the end iterations and got them all really good, they started selling them in, towards Apple people, which spend a lot of money. So I still use it because it's kind of like the reference amp for these. So it's just kind of handy for that. It's compact and it's exactly the right wattage. These go up to 100 watts, same exact wattage as the LS50s. They have even the same crossover point, which is weird, and the same port tuning, which means this thing goes down to 52. The port boost is at 52 hertz, which means it goes down to about in room, like under 50, which is not something you typically need because you would usually add a subwoofer anyway. But besides that, the way the driver is designed, it has these radial fins. The little radial fins on the back work as these weird ABR mechanisms due to the fact that this thing has this rounded shape. In the back, you can kind of see the outline of the fins. They go inward and wedge. But not only that, but they're actually fatter towards the center than they are on the outside, which means that when the thing is stroking backward, it's actually creating an air cushion, and any sort of, it's kind of almost like a mechanical heatsink. Any sort of resonance that would actually occur from any sort of uneven pistoning just ends up occurring as it gets absorbed by the radial fins in the back, which then ends up pushing backwards at an angle that isn't exactly perfectly perpendicular. Therefore, it ends up resonating, drawing actually dampening the front of the woofer, while also feeding more power to the rear because the rear is funneled and the actual radial fins are perpendicular. So there's literally like a phantom air cushion that it builds, because whenever the cone pushes backward, between each of the fins, it gathers air. The fins themselves are thin enough that they actually resonate, behaving almost like these axial ABRs. Each one of them actually and it keeps the whole entire thing below the same exact percentage of distortion as the blade. So from 200 hertz on up, it's 0.2% distortion max. And that means that even goes down to less than 1%, less than 0.1%. It only starts shooting up if you just start heading towards the port frequency, because that's kind of how all speakers do, right? After the port frequency, then it starts, bottoming out. But this thing, for what appears to be a satellite, has a 52 hertz port frequency, which makes no sense. It's bizarre because the other thing, which is the LS50s, which are full-size notebooks, also have a 52 hertz port resonance, and so they both bottom out at the same frequency somehow. And that's pretty much just because of the mechanics of the drive. They're both also equally as loud. They both have the same wattage. They both have the same. This was the first to have the 2-inch voice coil, which is oversized, and then the LS50 also had the 2-inch voice coil as well. And then this was first to also have. Actually, I don't know. I guess it would be the first. Yeah, because see this ring right here. This ring right here is two things. There's actually a gap around the tweeter, which is one of the biggest issues with LS50s, which you actually see a lot of people mention nowadays, which is where if you blast LS50s above like just regular listening volumes, there's gonna be this weird distortion that happens. And the reason why is because the tweeter relies on the woofer to actually work as its waveguide. Just imagine, think of the carts, right? Like any typical a Rendell, if you were to take this woofer and just make it and just unplug it, it would be the shape of a waveguide for a tweeter. That's pretty much how you would do it, right? But this waveguide also happens to be a woofer, so it has to be timed so that it's aligned with the tweeter, so that they both end up converging. The way that the horn and the tweeter and the flare work together, the sound from the tweeter ends up crawling out on the XY axis, where it actually bumps up against the waveguide, giving the illusion that there's actually the sound of the tweeter and the woofer meeting here and dispersing from the baffle itself, which is really interesting technology. It's just pretty much like the first time they ever did that. And it's made so solid that you could pretty much drop it on pavement and nothing will happen. In fact, I think I did drop this on pavement. I could show you like the scratch on it because I don't really care. But yeah, right there. See? And I could just like touch that up on it too with like some freaking nail polish, because these are the ones I care about the least. This baffle is actually removable, which means that you could actually make your own baffles and literally test your own baffles on them, which is bizarre. But yeah, that's another detail that they decided to add for no apparent reason. Because the thing is that when you make these things, you have to pay for each of those things custom. And typically when you make anything, you kind of want to recycle things. You want to make it as efficient as possible. You want to, cut corners, cut costs. But this is the exact opposite of that. As opposed to having some kind of aesthetic, just, black flat front, or doing the egg type thing where it's just, shaped backward, or the LS50s were shaped backward, they arched it forward just enough so that it matters. See it? And that also means that when they made these things, they actually had to make them. They created trouble for themselves to the point where they had to make them both out of metal and a frame of plastic. So this is metal, this is plastic, and it's magnetic because this whole entire thing is completely continuous, and it fits snug into its little groove right there, so it can't slide off no matter how bassy it gets. But it fits perfectly snug because both are actually crescents. And that's another weird detail of why did they do that. And the reason why they did that was because this thing is over engineered as hell, and it's still being used to this day for prototyping. And so I would recommend it in the sense where if you want to get an entry level KEF and just kind of understand what KEFs do, how to position them, how to get the stereo holography where you actually do hear sounds from behind you and above you, etc. You're going to get it much more from these than you do from most other ones, especially at any price point below $1,000. And when you typically get these, they come with these stands. I I always get the actual stands because it makes them an instant upgrade because it automatically locks them so that they're always facing the same exact axis, right? Because that's optimal. Normally they come with these feet that can swivel in any direction, which is cool. You can use them as computer speakers. You could use them anywhere because you could swivel them up and down, left and right. But that also makes it so that you have to actually make sure that you do have them perfectly symmetrical. And it kind of really reminds you how much expectations actually shape your end results, because if you think that you could only get a certain amount from something, then you're only going to work that hard to get it. Whereas if you actually know that there's something more to it, then you're going to actually get as much as you can out of it, which is actually way more than you ever thought possible. So by getting these optimized, which takes a few steps actually, because if you get the older ones, you have to cut a resistor off. If you get the newer ones, they don't have the resistor anymore. They sound fine, and you want to try getting them matched. All speakers vary. These tend to vary more because they're in a pivotal swap. If you look at KEF's history between the XQ series and the LS50, there was this gigantic, weird, almost as if the company just had a stroke and forgot what it was doing and had to do everything again from scratch. Compare the IQ 90s to the new Q. They look like completely different companies. And that was pretty much the reason why, is that they had to do this whole entire new experimentation with the idea of using a waveguide that would allow for perfect distribution of air on the XY axis, which then means they could use elements outside of the driver, which means they had to get rid of the actual rubber surround. Not get rid of, I guess. They had to make it, they had to reseat it, flatten it, get out of the way. So that allowed them to then start modeling things outside of the driver itself and make it so that elements outside of the driver itself are actually acoustically active. Just like the way this has a lip outside of the flare lined up so that it's a continuum. It's literally a continuum. So it's as if you were to unplug this thing, the tweeter would use the whole entire baffle as if it were a waveguide. If you were to have both of them plugged in, then this whole entire thing behaves as if it's one continuous single point sound source that uses this thing as its waveguide. So it's basically a waveguide inside a waveguide inside a waveguide. And it's the only thing you could get pretty much that actually has that pretty much for like on the LS axes don't have that. They're actually made because the LS50s had to be tuned to be, they're actually considered the best vocal monitors because they're based off of the best vocal monitors. They're based off of the LS35As, which were BBC's first stereo standardized monitors, and they needed it because it was like the rise of stereo sound. And so they were broadcasting in stereo, and so they needed some sort of a reference. And so they actually hired KEF. KEF was not a speaker company, they were actually a materials company. The sound KEF actually stands for the initialism KEF, which is actually Kent Engineering Foundry. There's no actual acoustics in there. It's just engineering foundry. Because at the time, what they excelled at was actually making materials. And how do you make really good instruments? And at the time, plastics were not considered bad because plastics actually have the ability to pretty much take on any shape, any mass, have any sort of property that you would pretty much want as long as you're good enough at making them. So the original LS35As actually had plastic woofers because they were actually custom made. They actually had, the mass and the stiffness and the shape that was necessary to match with the tweeter. And the box was made out of birch. It was solid birch and it was really thin. And so those things aged really, really well, just like Stradivarius violins or something. And those things now fetch off. And if you get a pristine pair, I've seen them go for like $30,000 because they only made they were made for industrial use. So they only made, I think, like something like 10,000 of them. But when they made the LS50s, in order to kind of explain that they weren't doing what they used to be doing anymore, this is actually an XQ style driver. This is a custom model driver because I actually liked having this IQ 90 style box because it's actually my favorite box that they've ever made. It's a solid bowed piece of wood in the back, solid bowed piece of wood in the front, and wood top, wood bottom, and it has literally a hunk of copper on top, just to make sure that the resonance from the top doesn't cause any resonance down. And also it has this neat little detail where the top to here are actually pretty much 1.67, which is actually what you'd call the Goan ratio. So that even though these are electronically in parallel, this one and this one always play out of sync. So these are actually pretty much impossible to measure because, first of all, KEF, you're not supposed to listen to them from the front. If you have never used a KEF speaker before, the first thing you gotta do is stand right in front, listen to the tweeter. You can hear the sound coming from here. Then do this. You're suddenly gonna hear the sound migrate to here, and that's the sweet spot. Anywhere around about 120 degrees, you're gonna hear the sound coming from the woofer. And that's the whole wide sweet spot thing. The only place you really don't want to be is right dead on axis. And that's why KEFs are always shown pointed straight. I'm only pointing them inward to clear the wall. But you want to tell them wide so that you're never actually, in the traditional way where if you have the speakers facing at you, you don't ever want to have that with these. You always want to have it so that you're listening to both the combined tweeter and the woofer sound as a single point coming from the flare itself. But a detail about these is, like I was saying, the last generation, it had this roll around it, which meant that the tweeter and the woofer only had this much time to converge and sound as if the tweeter and the woofer were one source. So they actually had to make a flare. You see it? They actually had to make a flare and then a flat rim right there. That flat rim right there is actually an outer rim around the flare, which is pretty clear, right? It's not an optical illusion. You can actually see it pretty clearly. You can see how they made it. This clearance ring right there is enough time for the tweeter, in whether it's playing at higher or lower frequencies, to actually play on phase with the woofer, so that they'll end up being dispersed from the whole entire thing. At some given point, as the tweeter is dragging along and playing and using this thing, the negative air pressure of the woofer as a waveguide, the tweeter will be on phase with the woofer and will end up being merged and interlaced with the woofer as the woofer woofs. Or it is actually a mid as a midder mids. So the mid woofers. So it ends up sounding as if the whole entire thing is capable of playing full range from the frequencies of the tweeter to the frequencies of the woofer, because sound from the tweeter not only follows a flare, but has this extra little space right here that's just a flat plane that it then is able to project sound from the tweeter out at you. Anything that is too late just ends up hitting the gutter. They changed that design ever since they added this thing. So they added this thing, and this thing is really what caused the next generation of Uniqs. This thing has a flare on the edges. It may not look like it, but because it's sharp in the front, but the back is actually thick. It covers about, I'd say, 70% of the tweeter. You can kind of see it if you look closely. Here, I'll show you the other ones. But yeah, just remember the flare, okay? Remember how there's actually a flare here and a flat rim. And you're gonna see something interesting. So if you got the LS X's, you would be getting a smaller version of these things. That's the point, right? And they use DSP in order to try to sound as much like these as possible. These are passive, and you're supposed to just feed them with really good material. If you don't have good material, then you get the LS50Ws, and some people like it, some people don't. I don't personally like active stuff because you're just stuck with the sound. And oftentimes, like, you don't like the DSP, or don't like the, this. It's just, you're just stuck with the digital signal processing it has, and you're stuck with the amp it has, and that's it. You can't do anything else. You can't upgrade it. And as much as it has options to do different DSP settings, I actually don't even like to have DSP settings on at all. I just like to have the speaker operate the way it just does. And any sort of oddities I hear, I fix in the room, which is ideally how you should do it, really. So these I actually even have raked up. So they're on a tripod, so they're facing upward, because I don't ever want to actually hear directly from the tweeter. Even when I'm in front of it, I want to hear from here, or I want to hear from here. So what I was saying before, remember how it used to have a flare and then a flattened part? It still has a flare and a flattened part. What happened was they took the flattened part and they actually turned it into a surround. That's called Z-Flex. The Tangerine Waveguide has a bigger horn. In fact, this whole entire thing, remember the flare in the past? This whole entire thing is literally scaled up. This used to be 3/4 an inch. You remember how small this thing was. This flare used to be, about this big. And now they're all literally 1/3 bigger. Both the tweeter, the flare, is scaled up to this entire size of the driver, plus this flat rim right here, which now operates as the surround and as what the outer rim used to be. And notice how it doesn't have to be as long anymore. That's because now it can't miss. Because as opposed to before, when it would use timing, and then it would just kind of, anything that didn't make it would just hit the gutter, the surround. Now there is an outer surround. I added this just for testing, because I wanted to hear the sound from, this thing. Usually, here, let me do some magic for you. Yeah, this is how it normally looks. So, this horn right here aims directly at this. So it's impossible now for sound from the tweeter and sound from the woofer to ever not converge, because as opposed to relying on timing, it's actually relying on angularity. So since they perfected the axial dispersion, this thing's a sound lens. I call it the Tangerine Slicer, because everything is a freaking waveguide. So, or I call it, yeah. So the Tangerine Slicer, Tangerine Radiator, or whatever, it expands air outward around the rim just as evenly as it does forward and backward. Whereas typically a dome, when it's pistoning, it doesn't actually have as much reliability around the edges that just graze the air as the front, which actually creates a hotspot. This does the opposite and equalizes that. It actually reduces the amount of pressure in front and redistributes it so that there's actually more pressure along the rim. So that means that the air is now firing out equally from the dome, as if the dome were kind of just, getting bigger. So that means that air isn't just going forward, it's going in every single direction. And the fact that they were able to master the sprawl of the dispersion this way meant they were able to aim it this way, which means they're able to get it to just geometrically align with this thing, which works both as the outer acoustic rim of the woofer, but because the end of it is suspended, no matter how much the woofer travels, this always stays in a stationary position. So the tweeter will always hit this thing. It has no choice, because the edge of this thing stays put. And then the woofer will always end up woofing forward the sound of the tweeter. And then you get a secondary radiation of the tweeter from this thing, which is why it also even has like the little cool like dimple things. It's because it helps kind of scatter the sound of the tweeter, and it makes it sound like a ghost tweeter that's coming from around it. So you listen to it from like up close, you actually kind of hear like the sound from the middle, and kind of like a phantom sound of almost like secondary radiation or diffraction or something like that, but it's controlled diffraction from around the outside. And you can actually measure it. You got like the tube from a stethoscope, and you actually just measured it. You can actually hear like a peak of sound right here that's coming from the tweeter. And so both the sound from the tweeter and the woofer will always either come from somewhere in here, or at the latest come from the outer rim. And then on this guy, you don't have that limitation. It ends up always hitting the entire waveguide, the entire flare of the waveguide itself. So instead of just this rim right here, it actually shapes the sound in a way that is designed as something that they wanted, meaning that it has more axial dispersion like this way than it does vertical dispersion. So more lateral dispersion and less vertical dispersion, because ceiling and floor dispersion is bad, and the ability to increase lateral dispersion just means more even crossover when you have the speakers pointing forward and they're side by side, and you have them more distant. It's gonna have some limits. I mean, you can't put them like obviously like 20 feet apart, but the fact that they have such wide dispersion means that you have a lot of flexibility as far as its placement, where because it disperses so wide, the summing of the image can then actually ends up behaving almost as if the way that you want to sum your drivers, your mains or your notebooks with your subwoofer. You want it to be an even line. So the level between this and that, if I were to play a tone that sweeps from there to there, it sounds even and it sounds flat because the dispersion is even. It is wider than it is tall. And that's kind of how they did it. So yeah, I don't know if I'm overselling them, but like they're very, very affordable, and you should probably check them out. Kind of see how my camera is actually really excited about them. But yeah, they're a very future forward speaker because they were made to basically test all the things that a KEF would then later on apply. For instance, that little gasket on the inside, that was only applied this generation with MediaTek. Everything people are hearing with MediaTek is really just the missing gap. This little gap here used to actually chuff, which would break down the radiation of the tweeter, which is supposed to use the woofer. So what happens when air comes out of here? What happens when air goes in? It causes either like congestion, because air cannot travel from the tweeter to its waveguide, or it causes shoutiness because there's a negative air pressure, and so it actually kind of ends up rushing it. So it ends up louder than necessary. So that's why if you actually end up hearing this weirdness when they turn it up to louder volumes. This doesn't have that. This actually has a little gasket in between, so that no matter what, any volume, it's not gonna ever cause any discontinuity. Besides that, it's also the only one besides the blade that has the voice coil actually aligned not on the inner rim, but here. It's actually aligned about 1/3 around the inside of the woofer, because it actually makes it way more stable. The way that, because the back fins exist, it allows them to actually place the coil inside of the fins, which is able to hold it. Typically, they just glue it into the center, because that's where you glue the coil. But because they had the fins to work with, they could cut a circle into the fins, and they could just mount the voice coil right into like the circle in the fins itself, and then it grips, and then it pushes and pulls much more pistonically from here. You can actually feel it, that there's actually like this kind of solid feeling right here, versus having the voice coil right there, which is how it typically is. That's also something the blade has. So yeah, I would look for these. They usually go for like between 300 to like 400 ish. You get them from England, you have to pay for shipping, so it's gonna seem cheaper. So if you live in England, then I guess you could probably get them cheaper there. I think because the weird price discrepancies. But the issue is that people are actually doing like a lot of weird liquidation because they're kind of there's a lot of chop job operations out there, and you could tell that they're actually getting rid of stuff that is not in grade A condition, and they're gonna do everything they can to make them look good. So avoid ones where the front look like they're glossy, because that means they're literally covered in oil or something. Give it like freaking Brazilian wax job or something. You want it just to kind of look like this. Even if it looks like a little bit dried out, it's not too bad. If it's dried out, it's actually pretty easy to just literally add like a dab of like coconut oil and just clean. Because since this is actually silicone, it's a silicone rubber. You can actually just rub it and clean it with using any kind of natural oil. Just like this round is actually butyl rubber. So any of those things could just be cleaned with just a little bit of a little dab of oil and water, and you just kind of scrub it around using like a really soft cloth. And this is plastic, this is metal, and there's a seal, so you could, it's really sturdy. Besides that, so as long as it passes inspection, then there's a gasket right here. It's airtight, and the only hole is right there in the back. And that's about it. Yeah, and when you get them, typically they'll come with the feet, and the feet, I'm gonna type down an explanation on how to use them, because you want to make sure you angle them exactly properly. Because one of the main reasons why people don't notice how good these things are is, one, they were sold as a hodgepodge 5.1 setup where they're just kind of like shoveled together, and people just, two, mounted them on walls, which if you mounted this thing on a wall, it would sound like crap too. Three, and people now in the secondhand market are shuffling them even worse, especially because the serial number is actually attached to the foot. So once you remove the foot, how else are you going to tell what the hell this thing is? The way you tell, besides that, secondarily, is actually by looking at the detail. These, because they're made as prototypes, are actually really high grade matched. All speakers vary, and that's why it matters that these actually have, these limited edition ones have matching serial numbers. That means that they're made with as close as possible with the least variance, right? These were also made as a matching pair. They're made as a matching pair so much that they literally mirror, and the serial numbers literally are the same thing, but one extra little indicator that tells you they have a matching pair. And yeah, so I mean, you get them kind of if the numbers are kind of close, then that's a good sign. If the waveguides match, it's a good sign. If they mirror like exactly, it's a good sign. Because the thing is that if I took this thing and I flipped it upside down, it would end up mirroring exactly the other one. The way they made them symmetrical was simply by flipping one of them 180. So that way it would actually be a perfect match between the two of them. So that could be tested as a stereo pair, and it'd be perfectly symmetrical. And the feet have a little screw in the back that has a tiny little Allen wrench hole that looks almost like a reset pin hole. Once you get them and position them, you want to position them so they're perfectly straight and perfectly angled as I use pink noise, but you don't have to. But just make sure they're set them side by side. Make sure they're vertical, and then you lock the bottom two, and then you lift the cable cover, and there's a tiny hole in the back, which is actually a third little hex screw, which is you're gonna have to use the smallest Allen wrench you have, and you stick it in there and twist it, and it actually tightens and locks it. So yeah, check that out. Thanks.